In the dusty heart of Wyoming, a horse called Black Ember had broken bones, ruined cowboys, and left legends in his wake. No rope, no rider, no man could tame him. But when a young woman stepped into the ring, the unthinkable happened. The beast lowered his head. What followed wasn't just about a horse. It was a revelation that ripped open 2 decades of silence, exposing a truth that shook a family, a town, and the man who thought he owned it all. The late afternoon sun stretched low over Cheyenne, Wyoming, casting long beams of gold across the dust-choked fairgrounds, where the annual livestock auction drew ranchers from every corner of the state. The air carried a mingling of scents: dry hay, leather worn smooth by work, and the tang of sweat from both horses and men. Pickup trucks lined the dirt road, their beds rattling with feed sacks and coiled ropes, while families climbed into the wooden bleachers, faces flushed with heat and anticipation. The auction wasn't just business here. It was theater, pride on display, and today Jacob Rourke, the man everyone in 3 counties knew, was the star of the show. Rourke stood tall at the center of the barn's ring, his silver belt buckle glinting each time the sunlight slanted through the rafters. At 60, his hair had gone to steel and his jaw to granite, but his voice still carried the weight of a man no one dared challenge. The crowd hushed when he raised a hand. Beside him, held by 3 men straining at the lead ropes, was a beast that seemed less like a horse and more like something conjured from the raw fury of the plains. Black Ember. The stallion's coat shimmered jet black, every muscle tight and restless, his nostrils flaring as if he breathed fire. A jagged white blaze slashed across his forehead, shaped like a flame, the mark that had earned him his name. He reared suddenly, hooves striking the air, and the handlers cursed, boots scraping deep grooves into the dirt as they fought to hold him. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some men swore under their breath, while mothers pulled children close against their skirts. Jacob Rourke's voice rose above the chaos, gravelly yet deliberate, the kind of voice meant to cut through storms. 15 seconds, he declared, letting the words fall heavy into the silence that followed. Any man or woman who can stay on this devil's back for 15 seconds will own him, free of charge. The barn erupted with disbelief. Laughter, scoffing, mutters of madness filled the air. But beneath it all was the sharp spark of greed. 15 seconds. 1/4 of a minute. To own a horse like Black Ember would mean prestige, power, maybe even fortune. An old cowboy near the rails spat into the dust. "Ain't a soul alive can last 2 seconds on him," he said. "That thing'll tear a man in half before he knows which way's up." The stallion struck the ground, dust exploding around his hooves, his scream echoing like thunder, trapped inside the barn. The sound tightened every throat, because it wasn't just noise. It was defiance. It was a warning. Rourke leaned against the rail, his mouth twisting into something between a smirk and a dare. His eyes scanned the crowd, pausing on familiar faces. Ranchers who'd lost stock to wild mustangs, rodeo riders with bones healed wrong, young men burning for a chance to prove themselves. He saw the hunger there, the whisper that maybe they could be the one to do the impossible. Sheriff Howard, standing at the back with his hat low against the sun, shook his head slowly. He'd seen Rourke's games before, but this was more than a game. This was cruelty wrapped in spectacle. Black Ember wasn't some bronc raised for rodeo. He was wild blood, unbroken, captured from the high ridges and dragged into a world he refused to bow to. The sheriff's stomach twisted as the crowd's excitement built. "Come on then," Rourke barked. "Where's the cowboy with the guts? 15 seconds for a legend." For a long, stretched moment, no one moved. The only sound was Ember's labored breathing and the nervous shuffling of boots on dirt. Dust hung in the sunbeams like smoke, swirling in the thick silence. And then, as though fate had grown tired of waiting, a figure stepped from the shadows near the side entrance of the barn. A woman. She wore jeans scuffed pale at the knees, a button-down shirt faded from too many washes, and a crimson scarf knotted firm at her throat. Her boots tapped steady against the boards as she walked forward, the crowd parting around her as if pulled by an invisible current. No one knew her name, but her presence drew every eye. She stopped at the edge of the ring, her gaze fixed not on Rourke, nor on the crowd, but on Black Ember. The stallion's ears flicked back, his chest heaving, muscles rippling like coiled lightning. For the first time all afternoon, he stilled. The murmurs rose in disbelief. A girl? A stranger? Sheriff Howard's brows pinched as recognition stirred in his chest, but the memory was too faint, too buried. Rourke's smirk faltered just a fraction, his jaw tightening as he studied her. The woman placed a hand on the rail, her fingers curled tight around the weathered wood. Her voice, when it came, was low but steady. "I'll ride him." The barn went silent again, deeper this time. Somewhere a child whispered, "She's crazy." A cowboy barked out a laugh, but it fell flat against the weight of her words. Jacob Rourke's eyes narrowed, searching her face as though peering through decades of dust. There was something about the way she stood, the quiet fire in her stare, that tugged at a corner of memory he didn't dare touch. He clenched his jaw, then spat into the dirt. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. He's not a horse girl. He's a storm wrapped in hide." The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes stayed on Black Ember, and in the quiet, her lips curved into something not quite a smile, not quite a frown. A memory flickered in her chest. Her mother's voice, soft as a lullaby, whispering about a colt with fire on his forehead. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for the madness to unfold. The storm had only just begun. The crowd in the Cheyenne barn could not quite decide if they should laugh or hold their breath. The woman who had stepped forward didn't carry herself with the swagger of a rodeo rider or the bravado of a cowboy aching to prove himself. She looked ordinary, too ordinary for this stage. Her jeans were faded to a gray blue, her boots cracked and dulled, the crimson scarf around her neck the only flash of color against the dust. Yet the steadiness in her step carried a weight that silenced jeers before they fully took root. Sheriff Howard felt his chest tighten. He'd been standing at the edge of the bleachers, arms crossed, trying to make sense of why she looked familiar. It had been more than 20 years since he had last seen Mary Bennett. Sharp-eyed, stubborn Mary, who had worked at the Rourke stables until she left town under whispers and shadows. Howard remembered the baby she'd carried, remembered the storm that followed, and suddenly the shape of the woman in front of him fell into place. The jawline was Mary's. The fire in her stare was Mary's. He muttered under his breath, "Lord above." Jacob Rourke shifted uncomfortably at the center of the ring. His hands, always calm and controlled, flexed against the railing as if it burned his skin. He didn't want to look too long at her, because the more he looked, the more the years peeled away. There were echoes in her face, ghosts in her eyes. But he steeled himself, biting back whatever clawed at his ribs. The last thing he would do in front of this crowd was let memory undo him. The handler struggled to keep Black Ember still. The stallion stamped the ground, nostrils flared wide, the whites of his eyes flashing. Yet when the woman stepped closer, his violence faltered for a single breath. His ears twitched toward her, as though catching a note in the air that no one else could hear. The crowd saw it too. They leaned forward, whispering to one another, unease mingling with awe. "Name?" someone shouted from the bleachers. She lifted her chin, her voice clear. "Clara Bennett." The name rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. The surname was ordinary, one of many in Wyoming, yet to a few in the barn it struck with precision. Sheriff Howard exhaled sharply, his suspicion confirmed. He whispered it again. Bennett, as if the sound alone might conjure the memory of Mary standing at this very place with dreams bigger than the town could allow. Clara kept her eyes on Black Ember, not on the crowd, not on Jacob Rourke. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, yet her steps did not falter. She had grown up hearing stories of this horse, though in her memories he had been nothing more than a colt, a spirited shadow trailing behind her mother on the Bennett pasture. Her mother had whispered about the blaze on his forehead, a white flame no one could mistake, and had said, "Some creatures carry fire inside them. You can't break them. You can only walk beside them." Rourke forced a laugh, the sound brittle. "You? You think you can ride him?" Clara turned her head at last, her gaze cutting into him with a calmness that made the words in his throat dry up. "I didn't come here for your wager," she said. "I came because he remembers me, and I remember him." The silence that followed was different now, heavier, charged. The handlers glanced at Rourke for instruction, their knuckles white on the ropes. Ember tossed his head, muscles quivering beneath the sheen of sweat, but his eyes stayed fixed on the woman with the crimson scarf. A cowboy in the front row barked a laugh to break the tension. "She'll be dead before her boots hit leather." His words sparked a few nervous chuckles, but no one truly believed them. Something about the scene unfolding carried a gravity that silenced bravado. Sheriff Howard stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "Clara, you don't have to prove anything to this crowd. That horse has ruined men twice your size." Clara's eyes softened when she met the sheriff's gaze. For a moment, the hard edges of her defiance slipped, revealing a glimmer of the girl she once was, the one Howard had glimpsed riding bareback across the prairie fields, her laughter trailing like birdsong. She shook her head gently. "I'm not here to prove anything, Sheriff. I'm here to remember. And maybe to remind him." Her words struck something deep in Rourke. He clenched his fists tighter, fighting the ache that surged in his chest. He remembered Mary whispering similar words once, long ago, when she had stroked the neck of a trembling colt with the same quiet fire. He had turned his back then, walked away from promises he hadn't been brave enough to keep. Seeing Clara now was like seeing the past step into flesh again, a reckoning he had not asked for but could no longer deny. The handlers, unsure of what else to do, let the rope slacken just enough for Ember to paw at the ground. Dust spiraled upward, the light catching each grain like sparks from a fire. Clara took a single step closer. Ember's ears pinned back, but he did not lunge. He snorted, head jerking, then froze when Clara lifted her hand, palm open. The crowd inhaled as one. Even the children who had been restless moments before sat still, their eyes wide. Ember's breathing thundered in the hush, but then something shifted. Small, almost imperceptible. His muscles eased, if only slightly. His head tilted, as though the storm inside him paused to listen. Clara's throat tightened. She whispered, low enough that no one else could hear. "It's me. I'm still here," the stallion blinked, a slow, heavy movement, and stepped forward half a stride. The handlers gasped, bracing for violence, but none came. Clara kept her hand steady, her body calm. When Ember's muzzle brushed her fingertips, a collective cry rose from the crowd. Shock, disbelief, awe. Jacob Rourke gripped the railing so tightly the veins in his forearms bulged. His face hardened, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with something he refused to name. Clara let her hand rest against the stallion's neck. His skin twitched beneath her touch, rippling like the memory of wind across tall grass. She felt his heartbeat thrumming, wild but alive. Not rage, but recognition. Tears stung the back of her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. The crowd erupted into murmurs again, voices overlapping in disbelief. "Impossible! How's she doing that? No one's ever—" The words filled the barn like restless birds, but Clara didn't hear them. All she heard was the pounding rhythm of Ember's heart beneath her palm, the echo of her mother's voice reminding her that some creatures carried fire inside them, and if you were brave enough, you could walk beside it. And in that moment, Clara knew. The reckoning she had sought wasn't just with the horse, and it wasn't just with herself. It was with the man gripping the rail across from her, the man who refused to meet her eyes even as his past stood in front of him, alive and undeniable. The barn still hummed with disbelief, voices layering like restless bees, but Clara no longer heard them. Her hand remained on Black Ember's neck, her palm rising and falling with his heavy breaths, and with every second she felt herself sink deeper into a memory that was more her mother's than her own. The heat of the stallion's body pressed against her fingers carried her back through years she could hardly recall. Fragments of lullabies sung over prairie winds, the scent of sweat and leather from long days in the stables, the soft hum of her mother's voice whispering truths that Clara had only half understood as a child. The crowd had begun to shift in mood. Where once there had been jeers and disbelief, now there was an uneasiness, even fear. Cowboys who had bragged about their own rides at rodeos stared, wide-eyed, at the way Ember stood beneath Clara's touch, as though tethered not by rope, but by some invisible thread. Rourke still clung to the railing, his expression stone, but his knuckles were white as chalk. He could not take his eyes off the woman standing where Mary Bennett once stood. It was as if the years had folded back on themselves, and time had betrayed him. Clara, meanwhile, let herself drift. The barn around her blurred. She remembered nights as a little girl when her mother would take her out to the edge of the pasture, lifting her onto a fence post to watch the horses move against the moonlight. There had been one colt, restless and dark, that always kept near, his small blaze glowing white even in the dim. Mary had whispered, "That one will never bow his head, but he'll know you if you learn to listen." Clara had laughed, too young to understand, yet the words burrowed into her. Now, standing before the grown stallion, she felt that seed blossom into truth. Ember snorted suddenly, tossing his head, and the crowd gasped, but Clara did not move away. Instead, she took a breath and hummed a few notes. Off-key, fragile, but familiar. It was the same tune Mary used to hum while braiding Clara's hair, the same tune she had sung to the restless colt to calm him in the stable shadows. Ember's ears flicked forward, and his body stilled again, as though he, too, remembered. Sheriff Howard saw the change and shook his head slowly in wonder. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. He had seen men use ropes, spurs, and brute force, but never this. Never a whisper of a song that could quiet a storm. He glanced at Rourke and caught the shadow that crossed the man's face. Regret, guilt, recognition. It was all there, if only for a flicker. Clara let her hand slide from Ember's neck to his shoulder, her fingers tracing the line of muscle, feeling the shiver ripple under her touch. She whispered again, words soft as smoke. "You're not alone. I'm here." To the crowd, it looked like madness, a woman speaking to a beast, but to Clara it was a bridge, built from memory and blood, between her mother's past and her own present. The silence thickened until it pressed like a weight on everyone's chest. Then a voice broke it. "She's fooling herself," a cowboy called from the bleachers, his voice sharp with fear disguised as bravado. "That horse don't remember nothing. Give him a second and he'll tear her apart." But his words rang hollow. Even as he spoke, Ember lowered his head slightly, his breath huffing against Clara's sleeve, warm and steady. For the first time since he had been dragged into the auction ring, the stallion looked less like fury and more like fire banked, waiting to be guided. The crowd fell quiet again, and even the skeptic lowered his gaze. Clara's eyes burned. She thought of Mary, her mother's hands worn from work, her back bent from carrying more than her share of burdens, her laughter rare but radiant. Mary had left Fair Creek with her child, and never spoken Rourke's name again, yet she had carried the weight of him in her silence. Clara had grown up with questions that never found answers, with nights lying awake wondering why her mother's eyes clouded whenever certain songs drifted in on the radio. And always, in the back of her mind, the image of a colt with a flame on his forehead. Now the answer stood before her, alive and breathing, his hide gleaming under the barn lights, his presence undeniable. She felt anger swell in her chest, not at the horse, but at the man across the ring. Jacob Rourke, who had turned his back on Mary Bennett, who had let pride crush, love, who now stood silent, as if silence could erase history. Her voice carried clear, trembling with restrained fury. "You think this is about a wager? About pride? This horse isn't your spectacle, Jacob. He's a memory. My mother's memory, and mine." The words hit Rourke like a strike. The murmurs rose in the barn, questions darting from one to another. Some recognized the name Bennett, recalled the whispers from decades earlier, the scandal that had never been spoken aloud, but never quite died. Sheriff Howard looked down, his jaw clenched. He had suspected, but hearing Clara speak it aloud carved the truth into the air. Ember tossed his head again, but not in rage. His eyes softened, ears twitching at Clara's voice, as if he understood that this was not just her battle. It was his as well. The moment stretched. The crowd waited for Rourke to answer, but the man said nothing. His silence was heavier than any denial. His shoulders sagged slightly, his age showing in the lines of his face, the wear of years he had spent trying to bury what could not be buried. Clara stroked Ember's neck, her own voice breaking just slightly as she whispered, "She told me you would remember." The horse pressed closer, his muzzle brushing against her chest like a child seeking comfort. A shudder passed through Clara, and tears she had fought for years finally slid free. The barn was utterly still. The only sound was the slow rhythm of the stallion's breathing, syncing with the beating of Clara's heart. For the first time in her life, she felt the flame her mother had spoken of. The flame carried not just by ember, but by her own blood. It was wild, untamed, and it had brought her here, to this moment of reckoning. The challenge had begun with a wager, but as the dust swirled and the crowd sat in stunned silence, it was clear to all that what burned in that barn was far greater than 15 seconds on a wild horse's back. It was memory. It was legacy. It was truth clawing its way into the open air. And Clara, standing with her hand on Black Ember's neck, knew she was ready to let it burn. The heat inside the barn pressed down heavy, as if the very rafters leaned closer to witness the impossible scene unfolding. Dust still hung in the air from Black Ember's restless stamping, but there was a hush now, a silence thick enough to make every creak of the wooden beams sound like thunder. The stallion's eyes, wild and bright as coals, stayed locked on the woman before him. For years he had been nothing but fury and violence, throwing riders like rag dolls, breaking bones, refusing every attempt at control. But now, as Clara Bennett's hand lingered against his neck, his eyes seemed different, no less wild, but tempered with something the crowd struggled to name. Clara drew a slow breath, feeling the warmth of the horse's hide beneath her palm. She remembered her mother's words, the warning that some creatures carried storms inside them, storms you could never cage, but only walk alongside. The blaze on Ember's forehead glowed white beneath the barn lights, and she thought of the nights long ago when Mary had pointed to that same mark on a colt and whispered that it was a sign, a flame born in the dark. Clara had been a child then, but now the truth of those words settled deep inside her chest. The handlers holding the ropes were frozen in disbelief, unsure if they should yank Ember back or let him stand. One of them muttered, "He's never done that before?" his voice cracking under the weight of fear and wonder. Sheriff Howard stepped forward, eyes narrowing as he studied the horse and the young woman. He had seen his share of rodeos, his share of bronc-busting disasters, but he had never seen a stallion this wild drop his head in quiet recognition. Jacob Rourke stood rigid at the rail, but inside his chest a storm raged. The sight of Clara's steady hand on the horse's neck tore open a wound he had buried decades ago. It was Mary's face he saw superimposed over Clara's, the same calm defiance, the same fire that would not yield. He clenched his jaw so hard that the muscle in his cheek twitched. The crowd could not see the memories clawing at him, but they could see his silence. And silence in a man like Rourke was more damning than any outburst. Clara leaned closer, her lips moving with words no one else could catch. Ember's ears swiveled, his breathing slowing, his eyes still fixed on her. To the onlookers, it was sorcery, madness. But to Clara, it felt like recognition, a thread strung from her childhood through her mother's stories into this very moment. She whispered the name her mother had once used for him, Flame, and the stallion shivered, not with rage, but with memory. A ripple moved through the audience. Men who had come expecting to see blood and broken bones now shifted in their seats, caught between awe and unease. A woman near the front clutched her child's hand tighter, whispering, "It's like he knows her." The words traveled, growing louder as they passed from lip to lip, until the entire barn buzzed with the possibility that this was not chance, but fate. "Enough!" Rourke barked suddenly, his voice echoing through the rafters. His face was flushed, his composure cracking. "This is a trick. That horse isn't tamed. You'll see the truth soon enough. His words struck hard, but even he heard the hollow ring in them. Clara did not flinch, did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on Ember, her body still, her hand steady. The stallion shifted his weight. The muscles in his legs coiled, but instead of lunging, he stepped toward her, closing the space between them. The barn erupted with gasps. A cowboy muttered a prayer. Another cursed under his breath. Sheriff Howard's hand went instinctively to the badge on his chest, as if the weight of law might anchor him in this storm of disbelief. But Clara stood her ground. Muzzle brushed against her shoulder, his breath hot against her neck, and in that moment the crowd was convinced they were watching a storm surrender. Clara closed her eyes, letting the sound of Ember's breathing fill her. She thought of Mary again, her laughter in the kitchen, her silence when asked about Clara's father, her endless strength in the face of whispers that chased them out of town. She thought of how Mary had always carried something unspoken, and how now, standing in this barn, Clara finally understood. This horse was part of that silence, part of that memory, part of the truth Mary had kept locked away. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for violence, but what they saw instead was stillness. Ember lowered his head further, the flame-shaped blaze on his forehead nearly brushing against Clara's chest. It was an act no one had ever witnessed from him, not even the handlers who had fought to restrain him day after day. To the men in the barn, it looked like surrender. To Clara, it felt like trust. She stroked his neck again, her voice low but clear enough for the nearest Rose to hear. You're not a storm to be broken. You're fire, and fire remembers where it came from. The words rippled outward, carried by the silence, until even those in the back felt the weight of them. Rourke turned his face away, his hand gripping the rail so tightly the wood groaned. He could not watch the past staring back at him, not in the shape of a daughter he had never claimed, and a horse that carried the ghost of the woman he had abandoned. The crowd noticed, and murmurs rose again, questions sparking in every corner of the barn. For Clara, none of it mattered. She felt the heat of Ember's body, the steady pulse beneath his skin, and for the first time since she had buried her mother, she felt that she was not alone. The eyes of the wild horse met hers, and in them she saw not just fury, but recognition. Not just fire, but memory. And in that moment, she knew that what bound them together was not chance, not spectacle, but blood and truth. Truth that the whole town was about to face. The air in the auction barn thickened until it felt like every breath might shatter. Black Ember stood so close to Clara that the heat of his body seemed to wrap around her. His ears twitched, nostrils flaring with a sound that rumbled low, but he did not strike. The crowd, dozens of ranchers, riders, wives, and children, watched in awe. Some leaned forward as though by leaning they could draw closer to the mystery. Others shrank back, uneasy that what they were witnessing might defy everything they had believed about beasts and men. Jacob Rourke felt their stares turning toward him. He was the man who had declared this challenge, the man whose pride had filled these rafters year after year. He had spent decades commanding crowds with a snap of his voice and the glint of his silver buckle. But now, as his hands gripped the railing, he felt the shift. Their eyes no longer saw him as the unshakable master of livestock, but as a figure caught between silence and truth. Clara stroked the stallion's neck again, whispering something none could hear. The great chestnut and black beast blew out a long breath, shoulders easing though his muscles still coiled like wire. The handlers looked to Rourke, uncertain whether to pull Ember away, but he gave no order. He couldn't. His voice had left him, trapped somewhere between rage and shame. Sheriff Howard cleared his throat from the side of the ring, his voice steady and low, but with an edge sharp enough to slice the silence. "Jacob, I've known you 30 years. I've seen you talk men down from fights and raise prices higher than a man could afford, but I've never seen you quiet like this. Why?" The sheriff's words stirred the crowd, feeding the whisper that had begun to crawl between them. Some of the older faces remembered Mary Bennett, the girl with fire in her eyes who had left town suddenly, whispers of heartbreak trailing in her wake. Their glances darted between Clara and Rourke, and suspicion took root. Rourke straightened, forcing his voice into the gravelly boom that once silenced whole barns. "This means nothing. A horse is unpredictable. He's tricked you. She's tricked you. Don't be fooled into thinking this is anything more than a show." But the words rang hollow, echoing in the rafters without the strength they once carried. Boone Carter, an old horsebreaker with scars along both arms, spat into the dirt near his boots and muttered just loud enough to be heard, "That ain't no trick. That's memory. I seen it once before, when Mary sang to a colt in this very barn." His voice cut deep, because everyone knew Boone never wasted breath on lies. Clara lifted her chin then, finally turning her gaze toward Jacob Rourke. Her eyes were steady, unflinching, as though every year of silence and every question about her mother had coalesced into this single stare. Ember stayed beside her, his flank brushing against her arm, the blaze on his forehead gleaming under the harsh lights. "This isn't a trick," she said, her voice carrying clear. "This horse knows me. He knew my mother before me. And you—" She let the pause hang heavy, each heartbeat a drum in the barn. "You knew her too, didn't you, Jacob?" The crowd erupted in murmurs again, louder this time, suspicion turning to certainty in their tones. Some shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to believe the auctioneer they revered could be tied to such a story. Others leaned closer, hungry for truth. Rourke slammed his palm against the railing. "Enough!" his voice thundered, but even in its force there was a crack, a fissure too obvious to hide. "You don't know what you're talking about. You've no idea who I am or who your mother was. You think a horse's nod means truth? You think whispers can change a man's name?" But Clara did not flinch. She took one slow step toward him, Ember following as if tethered by invisible rope. The crowd drew back instinctively, creating space as though the weight of what was unfolding needed room. Clara's scarf fluttered with the draft of the stallion's breath, crimson against the dust. "You can shout down this crowd, Jacob," she said softly, but with a force sharper than his booming voice. "But you can't shout down blood, you can't bury memory, and you can't deny what stands in front of you." Ember stamped once, the sound reverberating through the boards like a gavel striking wood. The noise startled some children, who clung tighter to their parents, but it also sealed the moment with an authority no man could imitate. Sheriff Howard's eyes narrowed, watching Rourke closely. "She's not asking for spectacle. She's asking for truth, and you're the only one who can give it." The barn grew unbearably still. Every person, every breath seemed suspended. Rourke's pride warred inside him with the truth he had carried like a stone in his gut for decades. To admit it would unravel him before them all, strip him of the iron mask he had worn. But to deny it now, with the fire of Mary's eyes staring at him from the face of this daughter, felt impossible. His lips parted, but no words came. Sweat glistened along his brow. He turned his face away, staring at the dust on the floorboards as if the answer lay there. The silence stretched so long that the murmurs began again, but now tinged with certainty. The silence was itself the confession. Clara reached up and laid her hand flat against Ember's blaze. The stallion lowered his head further, pressing into her touch, and she whispered just loud enough for all to hear, "You can't deny me. Not anymore." And in that moment, the weight of Jacob Rourke's pride cracked like dry timber. The crowd saw it, felt it. What had begun as a test of horsemanship had turned into a trial of truth, and the verdict was already written in the dust beneath their boots. The barn smelled of dust, sweat, and anticipation, a mixture that clung to the rafters as tightly as the whispers swirling through the crowd. Jacob Rourke still leaned hard against the railing, his jaw stiff, his silence speaking louder than any denial. The murmurs of the spectators rose and fell like waves breaking against the shore, accusations, awe, and disbelief mixing together into a storm of voices. In the ring, however, there was only stillness. Clara Bennett stood with one hand resting against Black Ember's blaze, her scarf lifting gently with every exhale from the stallion's nostrils. The two seemed frozen in their own world, a pocket of quiet that defied the chaos around them. Then, without hesitation, Clara turned toward the handlers, her voice cut clean through the air, steady and calm. "Take the ropes off him." The men blinked, unsure if they had heard her correctly. One shook his head violently. "Ma'am, that's suicide! This horse will tear the boards down." Clara's gaze never wavered. "He won't. Not with me." The demand rippled through the crowd, shocking in its audacity. Some shouted objections, others muttered prayers. Sheriff Howard stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Let her. If she believes it, then let her prove it." His words carried authority, and slowly, reluctantly, the handlers obeyed. The ropes fell away, and for the first time since he had been dragged into this place, Black Ember stood unbound. The crowd held its breath, waiting for an explosion of fury, for hooves to fly and boards to shatter. But the stallion remained still, his muscles taut, his eyes glowing like coals as they stayed fixed on Clara. She moved slowly, lifting the worn saddle from the fence rail where Boone Carter had dropped it earlier. Her arms trembled with the weight, but her resolve did not falter. She stepped close, whispering under her breath words no one else could hear. Ember shifted his weight, pawing once at the dirt, then lowered his head as she pressed the saddle gently onto his back. The sound that filled the barn was not the scream of a furious horse, but the creak of leather settling against hide. Gasps broke from the bleachers. No one had managed to lay a saddle on him without being thrown or bitten, yet here he stood, tense but still. Clara's hands worked quickly, buckling the girth strap, her motions practiced though not polished. She had learned by watching, by helping at rescue stables, never imagining she would need the skill for this moment. When she was done, she let her hand rest once more on his neck, her touch light as breath. Jacob Rourke's heart pounded against his ribs. Every muscle in his face pulled tight. He wanted to shout, to stop this madness, but the words lodged like stones in his throat. He could not tear his eyes away from the sight of her, the echo of Mary in every gesture, every whisper. Clara placed her foot in the stirrup. The crowd rose to its feet, a wave of disbelief sweeping through them. Some cried out warnings, others egged her on, desperate to see if she would survive. Ember tensed, his muscles coiling like springs, but he did not bolt. With one swift motion, Clara swung herself onto his back. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then the storm broke. Ember launched into the air with a power that shook the ground. His hind legs kicked high, his body twisted, and dust exploded beneath his hooves. The crowd screamed. A man shouted, "She's finished!" Another woman buried her face against her husband's chest. But Clara held firm, her hands gripping the reins lightly, her body moving with the stallion instead of against him. She whispered through clenched teeth, the words carrying only to Ember's ears. "It's me. You know me. Remember." The stallion bucked again, higher this time, his front hooves striking out, but Clara's boots stayed rooted in the stirrups. Her back stayed straight, her balance unbroken. The noise in the barn rose to a roar, the clatter of boots on boards as men stamped in shock and disbelief. Sheriff Howard stood unmoving, his eyes wide. He had seen men with decades of experience thrown within seconds, bones snapped like twigs, but never had he seen a rider, least of all a woman, a stranger, remain calm atop the beastja. Boone Carter muttered a curse under his breath, his hands trembling as he gripped the rail. She ain't riding him. He's letting her. And Boone was right, for after the third violent buck, something shifted. Ember slowed, his movements less wild, his breaths ragged but measured. Clara leaned forward, her hands soft against the reins, and whispered again. Her words were not commands, not orders, but reminders. She told him of nights on the pasture, of a woman with soft hands and a strong voice who had once loved him as a colt. She told him he was not alone. The crowd fell silent as Ember stopped fighting. He reared once more, a final test, his front hooves slicing the air, but when he came down, he did not throw her. Instead, he trotted forward, his stride long and controlled, as though he had remembered who he was and who she was to him. Clara sat tall, her scarf trailing behind her, the crimson fabric catching the light like a flame. Children peered over the railings, their eyes wide with wonder. Men who had once mocked her now stood slack-jawed, hats clutched in their hands. Women whispered prayers of thanks, their eyes shining with tear. The barn had turned from a theater of cruelty into a sanctuary of awe. Jacob Rourke closed his eyes, just for a moment, because he could not bear the weight of what he was seeing. It was Mary, all over again. The way she had once soothed a frightened colt, the way she had looked at Jacob with fire and faith, the way he had walked away from both. His chest ached with the memory, with the knowledge that his pride had cost him everything. Clara guided Ember in a circle, her voice still low, her hand brushing his neck in rhythm with his stride. The stallion's ears flicked back toward her, his head lowering in something close to peace. She whispered one final word, the name her mother had once given him. Flame. And the wild horse, the storm in hide and muscle, obeyed. The barn erupted with noise, not laughter, not mockery, but stunned applause and shouts of disbelief. Men slapped their hats against their thighs, women clutched their children tighter, and the legend of Black Ember shifted in a single breath. He was no longer untamable. He had chosen. Clara slowed him to a walk, guiding him gently back to where Jacob Rourke still stood frozen at the rail. She looked down at him, her face unreadable, but her eyes blazing with something he could not escape. Pride, pain, recognition. All of it tangled together. "You see," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the hush that followed. "He remembers. And so do you." Rourke's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time in decades, Jacob Rourke, the man whose pride filled every barn he entered, was stripped bare. The truth stood before him. In the daughter he had abandoned and the horse that would never forget, and there was nowhere left to hide. The barn smelled of trampled dust and leather oil, the kind of scent that clung to memory like an old wound. Black Ember stood steady beneath Clara, his massive chest rising and falling, every breath loud enough to echo against the rafters. The crowd had not sat back down. They were frozen, caught in that fragile space between disbelief and awe. Men who had laughed at her minutes earlier now held their hats pressed against their chests. Mothers clutched children tighter, not out of fear anymore, but because they sensed something larger than a contest had taken hold of this place. Clara's hands trembled against the reins, not from fear of the stallion beneath her, but from the weight of every eye staring at her and every memory clawing its way up from her chest. She felt her mother's presence, as if Mary stood in the sawdust beside her, whispering strength into her bones. Ember flicked an ear back, waiting for her voice. When she spoke, her words were not meant for the horse alone. "You all think this is about a challenge, about pride," she said, her voice carrying steady over the hush. "But this isn't about a wager. This is about blood." The words slammed into the silence like a hammer. The crowd shifted uneasily. A murmur rippled through the bleachers, suspicion sparking in whispers that passed from one mouth to another. Sheriff Howard stiffened, his hand twitching toward the brim of his hat. He had known it was coming, had seen the truth building in Clara's eyes, but still the bluntness of her declaration rattled him. Jacob Rourke's head jerked up, as if the air had been punched from his lungs. His jaw flexed, the vein at his temple pulsing, but no words came. He had lived decades commanding rooms like this one, his voice booming until men bowed and women hushed. Yet in this moment, with Clara's eyes searing into his tongue betrayed him. Clara swung her leg over and slid from Ember's back. The stallion shifted, his hooves scraping against the boards, but he did not bolt. He stood beside her like a sentinel, his shadow long against the barn floor. Clara took a step toward Rourke, her boots crunching softly in the dirt. Her scarf trailed down her back, catching in the light like a flame refusing to die. "You knew my mother," she said. "You knew Mary Bennett. You knew her better than anyone, and when she needed you, you turned away." The crowd gasped as the name broke into the open. Some of the older ranchers exchanged looks, their memories scraping back through years of gossip they had long buried. A few women covered their mouths. Boone Carter muttered a curse under his breath, though no one could tell if it was for Clara's boldness or for Rourke's shame. Rourke shook his head slowly, his hands tightening around the railing until the wood creaked. "You don't know what you're saying," he rasped. "You don't know the truth." "I know enough," Clara replied, her voice steady though her chest burned with every word. "I know that she left this town carrying me, carrying your silence, carrying the weight of a man who had sworn to love her, and then vanished when the promise cost too much." Her words cut sharper than any blade. The barn went still again. Every sound, the shifting of saddles, the restless coughs, even the shuffling of boots, ceased as if the walls themselves strained to listen. Ember nickered low, his muzzle brushing her shoulder as if to steady her. Rourke's face flushed red, then paled to gray. He wanted to roar, to deny, to drown out her voice with the booming authority that had served him for decades. But when he opened his mouth, the only sound that came was breath. He turned his head away, eyes searching for escape among the planks and posts of the barn. Sheriff Howard's voice broke the silence, calm but edged with steel. "Jacob, is it true?" The question hung heavy, impossible to ignore. The sheriff's authority carried weight. It wasn't just Clara asking anymore. It was the town. Rourke swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. At last he said, "She doesn't understand. She's confused. Mary was... she was..." His words faltered. He looked back at Clara, and for the first time allowed himself to see it fully. The fire in her stare, the tilt of her jaw, the echo of Mary's courage alive in her flesh. His voice dropped to a whisper. "God help me. She was everything." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rourke's attempt at denial collapsed beneath the weight of his own confession. Clara's knees felt weak, but she refused to let her body yield. She stood straight, her voice rising for the first time. "You left her. You left both of us. But you can't leave this truth behind. Not anymore. Not when the horse you thought was untamable remembers me better than you do." Ember stamped his hoof, the sound like a drumbeat sealing her words. Dust leapt into the air, dancing in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the rafters. The crowd's murmurs built again, no longer in disbelief but in judgment, in recognition of the reckoning unfolding before them. Rourke's face crumpled, pride and shame warring across every line. He had built an empire from livestock and grit, but in this single moment, that empire cracked. What stood in its place was not the feared auctioneer, but an old man confronted by the blood he had tried to forget. Clara felt tears burning hot behind her eyes, but she held them back. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her voice was sharp, carrying across the barn. "This isn't about winning a horse, Jacob. This is about the truth you buried." And today the whole town heard it. The barn erupted, not in laughter, not in applause, but in the restless roar of voices grappling with revelation. Some shouted that she was right, others muttered excuses for Rourke, but no one could look away. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back. And through it all, Black Ember stood by Clara's side, his head lowered, his ears angled toward her, as though the fire in his blood had always known the fire in hers. The barn had become a crucible, heat and silence pressing down until the walls seemed to sweat. Outside, the Wyoming sun burned low across the horizon, throwing sharp beams of amber through the slats in the wood. But inside, all light seemed to fall on Clara and the man she confronted. Black Ember stood beside her, a living shadow, his head low, the flame-shaped blaze on his forehead glowing as if it had been branded for this very hour. Clara's words still lingered in the rafters. "You left her. You left both of us." The echoes had silenced the crowd, turning their laughter and doubt into stunned quiet. The people of Cheyenne, ranchers hardened by winters, mothers who'd buried sons, Men who'd lost fortunes on horses that couldn't be tamed, now stared not at a spectacle, but at a wound long hidden, torn open in front of them. Jacob Rourke looked older than anyone had ever seen him. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight of decades had finally settled onto them. He opened his mouth once, twice, but nothing came. The words that had built his empire, the voice that could raise bids to the sky, failed him. He was left only with silence. Clara stepped forward, her boots grinding in the dirt, her hand still brushing Ember's mane as if the horse's steady presence could anchor her. She felt her pulse hammering in her throat, but her voice was calm, sharp, undeniable. "You wanted a show, Jacob. Well, here it is. Not the horse breaking, not the cheers you expected. This is your truth breaking open." Gasps rippled through the bleachers. Some of the older ranchers exchanged glances, men who remembered Mary Bennett's laughter, the way her eyes had once lit the barns of Fair Creek. Women whispered, clutching children who stared wide-eyed at the drama unfolding. The younger faces, those who only knew Rourke as the auctioneer whose word was law, looked at him now with doubt. And doubt was more dangerous than open rebellion. Boone Carter leaned against a post, his weathered face twisted. He spoke in a low growl that carried nonetheless. "I saw her, Jacob. Saw Mary singing to a colt in this very ring, same blaze on its head as that one standing there now. Don't you dare say you don't remember." Rourke flinched as though struck. His hands gripped the rail until his knuckles turned white. His voice came at last, raw and ragged, stripped of its usual command. "I remember." The admission dropped heavy into the air, pulling a collective breath from the crowd. He looked up at Clara, and the years melted away. "I remember her better than anything else I ever had, and that's why I left." The barn stirred with confusion, voices rising and falling like storm winds. Clara's brow furrowed, her anger flaring hot. "You left because you loved her?" she demanded. "You left because she meant too much? That's your excuse for a lifetime of silence?" Rourke's jaw clenched, his voice breaking under the pressure of the truth he had never spoken aloud. "I left because I was a coward, because I thought giving her my name would ruin her, because I thought the world I'd built, the greed, the pride, the enemies I'd made, would swallow her whole. And I told myself walking away was mercy." His eyes, red-rimmed, darted toward Ember. "But every damn day since I knew it was nothing but fear." A low cry slipped from somewhere in the crowd, maybe from one of the women who had known Mary, maybe from someone who recognized the bitter taste of regret. Sheriff Howard stepped forward, his boots striking the boards with deliberate weight. His voice was solemn, grave as judgment. "Jacob, what you did wasn't mercy. It was abandonment. And no excuse will scrub it clean." The sheriff's words hit like the swing of a gavel. Rourke's chest heaved. His face, weathered and proud, crumpled in a way no one in that town had ever seen. He lowered his hat, not in greeting, but in shame, his gray hair catching the last light. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to curse him for the years of silence, the years her mother had bent her back to the bone, raising a child alone, the years she had gone without answers. But standing there, with Ember pressing his muzzle softly against her arm, what came out was quieter, but sharper than rage. "You don't get to call yourself my father now. You don't get to undo the nights she cried, or the days she carried me while the town whispered. You lost that right." Her words sliced through him, and Jacob staggered back a step as though his body had taken the blow. His lips trembled, but no argument came. Pride had no place here. It had been stripped bare. left bleeding on the barn floor. The people of Cheyenne shifted uneasily. Some shook their heads, unwilling to let go of the man they had admired. Others nodded grimly, justice written across their faces. Irene Kavanaugh, the town's oldest gossip, stood at the back with her cane planted firm, her eyes burning brighter than any lamp. "She's right," Irene said loudly, her voice carrying. "We all knew Mary deserved better, and we stayed silent, just like him." The words rippled outward, spreading guilt among the crowd. Whispers of agreement rose, and for the first time the judgment was not just on Jacob Rourke, but on the whole town that had turned its back on Mary Bennett. Clara looked at them all, her chest heaving, tears burning at the corners of her eyes, though she fought them. She carried this truth alone. "I won't. Not anymore." Ember lifted his head. Ears pricked, his breath loud in the still barn. He stamped a hoof against the dirt, a sharp sound that made everyone flinch. To Clara, it felt like punctuation, the mark of finality on what had been buried too long. Jacob Rourke raised his head at last, his eyes hollow. He looked at Clara, then at the horse beside her, and for the first time in his long, proud life, he whispered words no one thought they would hear from him. "I was wrong." And with that, the wound that had been hidden for 20 years was torn open fully, raw and bleeding before the eyes of the town. The barn was silent once more, but it was not the silence of spectacle. It was the silence of reckoning, heavy and unavoidable, a silence that would not fade when the dust settled. The barn had fallen into a silence so deep it seemed the beams above might creak under its weight. No one moved, no one even dared cough. The dust floating in the golden shafts of light looked suspended in air, caught in the stillness that followed Jacob Rourke's whisper. "I was wrong." It was a phrase the people of Cheyenne had never imagined hearing from the man whose pride had built walls thicker than stone. Yet here he stood, his hat dangling limp in his hands, his face pale and weathered, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on the daughter he had never claimed. Clara didn't move either. Ember's shoulder pressed warm against her side, grounding her as her knees threatened to give way. She had dreamed of this moment in countless variations, angry confrontations, tearful revelations, bitter denials. But never had she imagined Jacob Rourke standing before her stripped of all armor, his voice ragged with a confession no amount of years could soften. The crowd rustled, their whispers gathering like wind before a storm. Irene Kavanaugh leaned heavy on her cane, her sharp voice cutting through the murmurs. "Go on then, Jacob. Tell her. Tell us all what you've kept buried." Rourke swallowed hard, his throat bobbing like a man about to face a hangman's noose. He looked down at his boots, dust clinging to the cracked leather, then raised his gaze to meet Clara's. His eyes were bloodshot, not from drink or exhaustion, but from the force of holding back tears he'd never allowed himself to shed. "When your mama told me she was carrying you," he began, his voice hoarse, "I was 25 years old and thought myself a king. I had land, money coming in from auctions, and enough pride to fill every acre of Wyoming. But what I didn't have was courage. Not the kind that matters. When she told me, I panicked. I told her I needed time. Time to think, time to figure it out. Truth is, I wasn't thinking at all. I was running." Gasps sounded in the bleachers, though quiet ones. A few men shook their heads. Some women pressed hands to their mouths. Clara's heart pounded, each beat echoing the words her mother had never spoken, aloud, but had carried in her silence. Rourke's voice cracked. "I told myself lies to make it easier. Said to myself Mary deserved better than a man like me, that giving her my name would tie her to the enemies I'd made, to the debts and fights I was drowning in. I told myself leaving was protecting her, but that was just a coward's excuse. He dropped his gaze, shame etched deep into the lines of his face. I wasn't protecting her. I was protecting me. The barn shifted, the people's judgment heavy in the air. Some muttered that at least he'd admitted it, others hissed that a real man never would have walked away. Sheriff Howard's eyes narrowed, his arms crossed tight across his chest, but even he stayed silent, letting Rourke's confession spill into the dirt. Clara's throat tightened, but her voice came clear. You left her to raise me alone. You left her to work herself raw while this town whispered behind her back. Do you know what it's like to grow up hearing your father's name only as a curse? To see the woman who loved you most break herself in half just to keep food on the table? Her voice cracked on the last words, but she held herself tall. Ember shifted his weight, nudging her arm, as though the stallion himself could sense the breaking point in her chest. Rourke's jaw quivered, and for the first time his tears fell. He didn't wipe them away. He let them trace the weathered lines of his cheeks, let them show what he had hidden for 20 years. Every night, Clara, he whispered. Every night I thought of her, and of you. I told myself I'd go back when I'd made enough money, when I'd built a life worthy of you both. But the years kept rolling, and my pride built walls I couldn't climb. And by the time I heard she was gone, he faltered, pressing a fist against his mouth as his voice broke. By the time I heard, it was too late. The crowd was utterly still. Even the restless children seemed hushed by the gravity of his words. The barn was no longer an auction hall, but a courtroom, and Rourke was both witness and defendant, spilling testimony no one had expected to hear. Clara's vision blurred with tears she fought to contain. Her mother's absence had been an ache so constant she had nearly grown used to it. But hearing the man before her admit his cowardice ripped the wound open fresh. You don't get to stand here and ask for forgiveness, she said, her voice trembling. You don't get to erase what you did with a few broken words. My mother deserved your courage. I deserved a father, and you gave us nothing but silence. Rourke nodded slowly, each movement heavy as though it carried stones. You're right. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't expect it. But I couldn't let you stand in this barn, looking me in the eye, and let another lie slip from my mouth. You deserve the truth, even if it's 20 years too late. Ember let out a low whinny, the sound startling in the silence, almost as if he, too, bore witness to the confession. The stallion stamped once, dust rising like smoke around his hooves. Clara laid her hand on his neck again, grounding herself. The crowd murmured, some voices sympathetic, others condemning. A rancher shouted, "Took you long enough, Rourke." Another muttered, "Least he said it. Most men wouldn't." The weight of judgment shifted back and forth, but the truth had been spoken, and no one could take it back. Clara felt her chest heave, as though the barn itself pressed down on her. She met Rourke's eyes one final time. "You can't undo the past," she said softly. "And you can't call yourself my father just because you finally found your tongue. You chose pride over us once. That choice doesn't vanish." Her words sliced through the barn like a brand through flesh. Rourke closed his eyes, his body sagging with the weight of her verdict. He set his hat back on his head, not with pride, but with the solemnity of a man who had finally been stripped bare. The silence that followed was not the hush of anticipation, but the echo of a wound laid open, a reckoning the whole town had witnessed. The people shifted uneasily, knowing they had seen something raw, something unrepeatable. The auction had ended, but the trial of Jacob Rourke had only just begun. The night had fallen heavy over Cheyenne by the time Clara led Black Ember out of the barn. The moon hung low, pale against the dark sweep of sky, and the air was sharp with the cool bite of early spring. The crowd had dispersed slowly, in clusters of whispers and sideways glances, their faces unsettled by what they had witnessed. They had not come for a confession, or for the unraveling of their proudest auctioneer. They had come for spectacle, and left carrying the weight of a reckoning they would not forget. Clara's boots scuffed the gravel as she walked, Ember trailing behind her on a loose lead. The stallion's head was low, his ears flicking toward every sound, but his body moved with her as if tethered not by rope, but by something deeper. She felt drained, her chest hollowed out from all the words she had spoken, yet the horse's steady presence at her side was a kind of anchor. The scarf at her throat clung damp against her skin with sweat, the crimson fabric darkened in patches, but she hardly noticed. The barn door creaked again, and Sheriff Howard stepped into the lamplight. His shoulders looked heavier than they had hours earlier, as though he, too, bore the burden of what had unfolded. He cleared his throat, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Clara!" She turned, her jaw still tight, her eyes rimmed red but defiant. "If you came to tell me I went too far, save your breath." Howard shook his head slowly, the lines on his face etched deep. "No. I came to tell you that you did what no one else had the courage to do. You dragged the truth into the open. And for that, Mary would be proud." The name hit her chest like a stone, knocking the breath out of her. For a moment, her composure faltered. She looked away, blinking hard, her hand tightening on Ember's lead rope. "She carried it alone for so long. I couldn't. Not anymore." The sheriff stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You should know. There'll be folks who won't thank you for it. Jacob's been a pillar in this town, even if his foundation was rotting. Some will stand with you, but some will turn away. You'll need allies if you mean to stay." Clara lifted her chin, the defiance flickering back into her eyes. "I've stood alone most of my life. I can keep doing it." Howard studied her, then let out a breath that was half a sigh, half a laugh. "Maybe you can. But even the strongest rider needs someone holding the gate." It was then that another figure approached, small against the glow of the lanterns. A boy, no older than 12, with hair shaggy from neglect and boots that looked a size too big. He carried a dented tin pail in one hand and a scrap of bread in the other. His eyes, wide and earnest, fixed not on Clara, but on the stallion beside her. "Ember," the boy whispered. His voice was soft, but the horse's ears flicked toward him instantly. Clara narrowed her gaze. "You know this horse?" The boy nodded, stepping closer, though caution slowed his steps. "I've been sneaking out to the pens at night, feeding him what I could. He was so angry, but he let me close. Guess he was just hungry for more than hay." His cheeks flushed as he added, "Name's Eli." Ember stretched his muzzle toward the boy, breathing in the scent of the bread. Eli held it out, and the stallion took it gently, chewing with a low rumble in his chest. Clara stared, stunned by the ease between them. For weeks, maybe months, while Rourke paraded Ember as a monster, this boy had offered him quiet kindness in the dark. Sheriff Howard raised an eyebrow, the corners of his mouth twitching. "Looks like you've got another ally, Clara, and a stubborn one at that." Clara crouched slightly to meet Eli's eyes. "Why'd you do it? Why risk it? Eli shrugged, his voice barely more than a murmur. Because I know what it's like to be locked out, to be treated like you're nothing. My pa left too. Folks don't listen much to kids like me, but horses listen. The words hit Clara deeper than she expected. She reached out, brushing a hand through Ember's mane, her other hand steadying the boy's pail. Then you know what this means. He's not a storm to be broken. He's proof of what we've all carried. The lies. The silence. The sheriff's voice was low, but his eyes glinted with a fire she hadn't seen before. Clara, if you mean to keep him, if you mean to stand here against Jacob and whoever still clings to him, you'll need to make a choice. This town's about to split down the middle. And once that line is drawn, you can't straddle it. Clara felt Ember's breath warm against her sleeve, felt Eli's small presence at her side, and the sheriff's steady gaze holding hers. She thought of her mother again, of the way Mary had sung in quiet moments when she believed no one listened. She thought of the years of silence, the years of carrying questions with no answers. And then she spoke, her voice firm. I'm not leaving. He's mine now, not because of a wager, but because he remembers. And because through him, I remember too. If this town wants to turn against me, let them. I won't walk away the way he did. Sheriff Howard nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though sealing a pact. Eli grinned shyly, clutching his empty pail. Ember tossed his head, the flame on his forehead catching the lantern light, burning bright against the night. The barn door shut behind them with a final creak, leaving Jacob Rourke alone in the shadows of his empire. He sat heavy on the rail, his hat low over his eyes, the echo of Clara's words still hanging in the dust. For the first time, Jacob felt not like the master of men and beasts, but like a man who had lost everything to his own silence. And across the darkened yard, Clara walked with Ember and Eli at her side, her shoulders squared, her path no longer uncertain. She had found allies in the most unlikely of places. The battle ahead would be fierce, but for the first time in years, she did not feel alone. The next morning, Cheyenne woke to a storm of whispers. In the diners, at the feed store, even in the narrow aisles of the hardware shop, people leaned over counters and spoke in voices sharp with judgment or hushed with sympathy. Clara Bennett's name was on every tongue, spoken with equal parts awe and suspicion. The events in the auction barn had spread like wildfire, each telling more dramatic than the last. Some swore she had bewitched Black Ember with sorcery. Others insisted she had been born with her mother's gift, and a few whispered she was Jacob Rourke's blood come back to haunt him. Clara felt the weight of it as she walked Main Street with Ember tied at a loose lead. The stallion's dark coat shimmered beneath the weak morning sun, his blaze bright as if freshly painted. People stopped and stared openly, their faces masks of conflicted curiosity. A woman drawing water outside the cafe nodded respectfully before quickly turning her back. Two ranch hands spat into the dirt and muttered loud enough for her to hear. She's just looking for his land. Ain't no other reason. Eli trailed behind her, small shoulders hunched under the scrutiny. He carried a bundle of hay under his arm, determined to help, though it was nearly too heavy for him. Clara caught his eye and gave a faint smile, but her stomach churned. She was no stranger to being watched. As a child, she had lived with the whispers that followed Mary Bennett everywhere. But to carry them now, in her mother's absence, was heavier than she expected. At the far end of the street, Sheriff Howard stood on the wooden porch of his office, arms folded across his chest. His presence alone quieted some of the mutters, though he said nothing. His eyes tracked Clara and Ember until they disappeared around the corner toward the stables. Only then did he step down into the street, tipping his hat against the glare of the sun, his face unreadable. Inside Boone Carter's stable, the air smelled of straw and leather polish. Boone himself leaned against a post, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw as Clara led Ember into an empty stall. The old horsebreaker's face was creased deeper than saddle leather, his eyes narrow as he watched the stallion move with surprising calm. Never thought I'd see the day," Boone muttered. "That beast walking quiet beside anybody, let alone you." Clara wiped her hands across her jeans. "He's not a beast. He just needed someone to listen." Boone spat into the dirt. "Maybe so, but don't think that'll change the minds of folks out there. Half of them think you're a miracle. The other half think you're a curse." He straightened, his tone sharpening. "And some of them, they think you're a threat to Jacob." The words struck like a spark in dry grass. Clara felt her throat tighten. "I never asked for his land or his name. All I wanted was the truth." "Truth don't keep men warm at night," Boone replied. "Land does. Power does. And Rourke's held both for longer than most of these folks been alive. You take that away, even just in reputation, and you'll find more enemies than friends." Clara didn't answer. She stroked Ember's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin. The horse flicked an ear back toward her voice, calm in a way that reassured her. Still, the old man's words echoed. She knew too well that towns built on pride and silence rarely gave up either without a fight. That evening, the division became visible. Outside the saloon, men clustered around, arguing loud enough to echo down the street. One voice shouted that Clara had brought shame to the town by humiliating Rourke. Another countered that it was Rourke's shame all along. Inside the cafe, Irene Kavanaugh told anyone who would listen that Clara had done what none of them had the courage to do, her cane tapping like a judge's gavel with every word. Yet at the feed store, the whispers turned uglier, words like liar and schemer thrown around as easily as coins on a table. Eli heard them too. He tugged at Clara's sleeve that night as they bedded Ember down in the stable. "They're saying you're after money," he said, his voice small. "They're saying you tricked him." Clara knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Eli, people say a lot of things when they're afraid. Jacob Rourke built himself up so high, they don't know what to do now that he's fallen. But I'm not here for money. I'm here because my mother deserved better than silence, and so do I." The boy nodded slowly, though worry still clouded his young face. Ember lowered his great head, snuffling at Eli's shoulder as if to reassure him. The boy laughed softly, his hand stroking the stallion's muzzle. For a moment, the heaviness lifted. But as Clara stepped out into the night air, she saw shadows gathered across the street. Men watching, their faces hard, their conversations hushed. They did not move toward her, not yet, but their stares carried the weight of judgment. The division was no longer whispers. It was becoming something sharper, something dangerous. Sheriff Howard appeared at her side, his boots crunching on gravel. His voice was quiet, but it carried a warning. "You've split this town clean down the middle, Clara. That kind of split never heals easy. You'll need to decide whether you mean to fight or to leave, because one way or another, this storm's coming." Clara looked back toward the stable where Ember shifted in the straw, his blaze glowing faintly in the lantern light. She thought of her mother's long years of silence, of the strength it had taken to carry truth alone. Her jaw set, her eyes steady. "I won't leave. Not again." Howard studied her for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "Then brace yourself, because Jacob Rourke ain't the only one with pride to protect." The sheriff walked away, his figure swallowed by the shadows. Clara stood in the street, the cold wind tugging at her scarf, the town around her buzzing with division. She felt the weight of it pressing from all sides, but Ember's soft nicker drifted from the stable behind her, a reminder that she wasn't facing it alone. Cheyenne had become a battlefield, and the war was no longer just about a horse or a family secret. It was about truth against silence, courage against pride. And the lines had already been drawn. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of wary stares and restless whispers. Clara felt the town watching her everywhere she went. Through cafe windows, from hitching posts outside the saloon, even in the quick silence that fell whenever she stepped into the feed store. She walked with her chin high, but each glance pressed against her shoulders like a physical weight. Black Ember was never far from her side, his presence both a shield and a burden, for his very existence seemed to fuel the storm dividing Cheyenne. Eli had grown bolder, trailing her openly now, running errands at the stable, even standing guard in the evenings when the shadows seemed to cluster thicker outside the barn. The boy's stubborn loyalty stirred something warm in Clara, though it also deepened her fear that the storm she had pulled down might swallow more than just her. On the third evening, as the sun slid low behind the ridges and the sky burned the color of embers, Boone Carter came to the stable. The old horsebreaker carried no rope, no saddle, only a saucine, folded paper clutched in his calloused hand. He looked older than usual, his face lined with something heavier than time. "Girl," he said, leaning on the stall door where Ember chewed lazily on hay, "I reckon you ought to see this. Been keeping it too long." Clara frowned, wiping her palms on her jeans. "What is it?" Boone held out the paper, his eyes flicking away. "A letter. Jacob wrote it 20 years ago. Gave it to me one night when the bottle had loosened his tongue. Told me to deliver it to Mary. I never did. Thought it was better that way. But maybe I was wrong." Clara's stomach twisted as she took the letter. The paper was yellowed, the edges soft with wear, as though Boone had handled it more than once in hesitation. She unfolded it slowly, her hands trembling, the ink faded but still legible. "Mary," it began, "I don't know how to write this without sounding like a fool. I never was much for words, unless they meant money. But I need you to know, I love you. I love the way you walk into a barn and calm beasts that would tear through any other man's rope. I love the fire in your eyes when you tell me I'm wrong. I love the quiet way you believe in me when I don't believe in myself." Clara's breath caught. Her mother had never told her of a letter, never even hinted at one. She read on, the words cutting sharper with every line. "I want to stand beside you. I want to give you my name. But I am afraid, Mary. Afraid of the enemies I've made, afraid of the weakness in me, afraid that I'll ruin you, that I'll ruin what you carry now inside you. Forgive me, but I am not brave enough. Not yet." The letter ended without farewell, the last line smudged as though by a hand trembling too hard to finish. Clara's vision blurred, her chest burning. She read it twice, then a third time, each reading carving deeper. Boone shifted uncomfortably, his voice gruff. "Found him crying after he wrote it. First and last time I ever saw Jacob Rourke cry. I thought maybe sparing Mary the pain of false promises was kinder. But now, seeing you, I reckon she had a right to those words, even if they were weak." Clara folded the letter carefully, her hands shaking. "She carried everything alone. All those years. And this sat in your pocket." Boone bowed his head, shame lining his face. "I was wrong. For a long time, neither spoke. Ember nickered softly, nudging Clara's shoulder, his dark eyes watching her as if he, too, sensed the weight of the paper she held. Clara stroked his muzzle absently, her mind tumbling through years of silence and unanswered questions. That night, she lay awake in the small room above the tack shop, the letter spread open on the table beside her. The lamplight flickered across the faded ink, making the words seem alive, whispering through the years. She imagined her mother reading them, imagined the mix of hope and heartbreak they might have carried. And she felt fury at Jacob for writing them but never delivering them, fury at Boone for holding them back, fury at the world for conspiring to leave her mother alone. Yet beneath the fury was something more dangerous: understanding. She could see her mother's fire mirrored in the words, could see the truth of Jacob's fear, cowardly though it was. It unsettled her, cracked the stone wall she had built around her heart. She didn't want to understand him, didn't want to see his weakness, but the letter made it impossible to ignore. By dawn, she had read it so many times the words no longer looked like language, but like scars pressed into the page. She folded it carefully, tucking it into the pocket of her jacket, close against her chest. She didn't know yet what she would do with it, whether she would burn it, confront him with it, or let it rot with the rest of the silence. When she stepped outside, the town was already awake, gossip drifting down the street like smoke. 2 men glanced her way and fell silent. A woman clutching her child crossed to the other side. The division was sharper now, a line drawn through Cheyenne. Clara felt it cut her in two, the weight of the letter pressing like a brand against her heart. Eli appeared beside her, his small face serious. "You didn't sleep," he said simply. "No," Clara admitted. She looked toward the Rourke Ranch on the far horizon, its porch light still glowing faintly in the dawn. She touched the letter in her pocket. "But I think he didn't either." Black Ember stood at the gate, his blaze bright in the early light, his ears pricked toward her as if he too waited for what came next. Clara rested her hand on his neck, drawing strength from his steady warmth. The town was watching. The truth was out. But the letter, fragile and damning, was a reminder that the past was not finished. It lived still, ink pressed into paper, a wound never healed. And now it lay in Clara's hands, a weight she could neither escape nor ignore. The morning sun bled across the Wyoming plains, turning the sky into streaks of copper and rose. Clara stood at the edge of Boone Carter's pasture, the folded letter heavy in her pocket, the words inside it searing hotter than any flame. Black Ember grazed nearby, his dark coat shining with dew, his blaze catching the light like a brand. Each time Clara's fingers brushed the letter, she felt pulled in 2 directions, one toward the anger that had shaped her life, and another toward something more fragile, something she dared not name. Word had spread fast. By mid-morning, half the town had gathered in knots outside the cafe and the feed store, waiting for the next ripple of drama. Clara walked down Main Street with Ember at her side, Eli trailing close behind. Faces turned to follow her, some with respect, others with suspicion sharp as knives. A few nodded solemnly, but more shook their heads, their whispers floating like smoke. She wants his land. She wants his name. She wants revenge. Sheriff Howard intercepted her at the crossroads, his eyes grim. "Clara," he said, tipping his hat, "Jacob's been restless since that night. He hasn't spoken to anyone but Boone. But this morning he sent word. Clara felt her chest tighten. What word? Howard studied her a moment before answering. He's ready to give you the ranch, the deed, all of it. The word struck harder than any whisper in town. The ranch was Jacob Rourke's empire, the symbol of his pride and power. To hand it over was more than an offering. It was an admission that the life he had built now belonged not to him, but to the daughter he had denied. Clara's breath caught, her fists curling at her sides. I don't want his land, she said, her voice sharp. I never asked for that. Howard's gaze softened. Maybe not, but sometimes the things we don't ask for are the very things that force us to decide who we are. That evening, Clara saddled Ember and rode alone. The stallion moved with a strength that thrummed beneath her, his hooves drumming across the prairie like a heartbeat. She rode until the town lights faded behind her, until only the wind and the whisper of grass surrounded her. The letter pressed against her chest with every stride, as though demanding an answer. She stopped at the ridge overlooking Rourke's land. The ranch sprawled below, fences stretching across golden fields. The house crouched against the horizon with its porch light flickering faintly. Clara remembered her mother's words about the place, the promises whispered once before they turned to silence. She imagined Mary riding these fields with a heart full of dreams, dreams crushed when Jacob walked away. Ember snorted, pawing at the earth. Clara stroked his neck, her voice trembling as she spoke aloud to the empty sky. What am I supposed to do, Mama? If I take it, I tie myself to him, to the name you spat like a curse. If I walk away, I leave behind what you once loved. I don't know which betrayal is worse. The wind stirred the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. Clara closed her eyes and let the sound fill her. Ember lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against her hand, as though offering the only answer he could. That the choice was hers, and hers alone. By the time she returned to town, the stars were sharp above the rooftops. Boone waited for her outside the stable, his face drawn and weary. He gave me this, Boone said, handing her a folded document. The deed, signed and sealed. He said it belongs to you now. Clara stared at the paper, her stomach twisting. The weight of ink and signatures felt heavier than stone. She didn't unfold it, didn't want to see her name tied to his. I can't, she began, but Boone interrupted. You don't have to decide tonight. But don't fool yourself, girl. This land isn't just his. Your mama gave her heart to it once. And that horse out there, he was born of these fields. If you turn your back on it, you turn your back on her too. The words struck deep. Clara's breath hitched, but she said nothing. She tucked the deed into her jacket, the paper stiff against her chest alongside the letter. Two weights, one of truth and one of legacy, pressing against her like twin burdens. She spent the night pacing the stable, Ember's dark eyes following her with every step. Eli dozed in a corner, curled under a blanket, but even in sleep his small face looked troubled. Clara leaned against the stall door, staring into the horse's steady gaze. You're part of this too, she whispered. If I stay, it's not for him. It's for you. For her. For us. The stallion shifted, lowering his head until his blaze brushed against her shoulder. Clara closed her eyes, letting the warmth steady her. For the first time, the anger that had fueled her began to shift, not vanishing but reshaping, like molten metal cooling into a new form. At dawn, Clara rode Ember out across the ranch land, the deed tucked inside her jacket. The fields stretched wide and endless, the fences casting long shadows across the golden grass. She felt her mother's presence in every gust of wind, every rustle of sage, every beat of hooves against earth. She knew then that whatever choice she made, it had to be hers, not Jacob's, not the town's, hers. And as the sun broke over the ridge, Clara spoke the words aloud, steady as a vow. "I'll keep it, not for him, for her, for me." Ember tossed his head, the blaze catching the light like fire, and in that moment Clara felt the choice settle deep inside her bones. She would not walk away. Not this time. The old auction barn smelled of sawdust and sweat, as it always had. But something felt different as Clara pushed open its heavy doors. Light filtered through the gaps in the roof, streaks of morning sun cutting across the floorboards that had witnessed generations of sales, bargains, and betrayals. Now those same boards would hold something else. Her return, her declaration, and perhaps her reckoning. Black Ember followed close at her side, his hooves thudding softly on the dirt-packed ground, his head held high, ears twitching at every sound. Word had already spread. By the time Clara stepped into the center of the barn, faces filled the bleachers, men and women drawn by curiosity or loyalty, others by anger and suspicion. Some had come because they wanted to see her fail, others because they sensed something was changing and wanted to witness the first crack of the earth beneath their feet. A hush fell as she stood there, her crimson scarf wrapped tight at her throat, her back straight as steel. Jacob Rourke was already there, leaning against the same rail where he had once commanded the crowd with pride. But his presence was no longer the same. His shoulders stooped, his face drawn, his voice absent. He looked like a man hollowed out by truth. Even so, his eyes followed Clara with an intensity that refused to fade, a storm still burning behind their tired surface. Clara laid a hand on Ember's neck, steadying him, steadying herself. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried. It threaded through the rafters and reached every ear. "I didn't call you here for business. I didn't call you for show. I called you here because silence has ruled this barn too long." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some leaned forward, others shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping the boards. Clara's gaze swept across them, catching familiar faces. Men who had bought and sold under Rourke's command. Women who had watched Mary Bennett walk away from town with her head high, but her heart broken. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said. "Some of you knew my mother. Most of you ignored her. But you will know me. Not as a stranger, not as a ghost of the past, but as the one who carries the truth you chose to bury." Black Ember tossed his head, snorting loudly, and the sound struck like a hammer blow in the silence. Clara pressed her palm to his blaze and continued. "This barn was built on more than cattle and pride. It was built on secrets, on silence, on a man's fear." Her eyes flicked toward Jacob, who flinched but did not move. "That ends now." The crowd shifted again, murmurs rising. Some nodded, their faces grim with agreement, while others frowned, unwilling to see their world rearranged. Clara's voice rose, her anger finally finding air. "You all called Ember untamable. You cheered when men were thrown, when bones were broken, when blood hit this floor. You called it sport, but he wasn't a storm to be broken. He was a memory, living proof of what you wanted to forget. You threw him away, just like you threw her away, and like me." The murmurs grew louder, some voices protesting, others urging her on. Irene Kavanagh wiped at her eyes with a handkerchief, muttering to the woman beside her, "Lord help us. She's right." Boone Carter, standing near the rail, gave a single nod, his jaw set hard. Sheriff Howard's eyes never left Clara, steady and sharp, as though silently reminding the crowd that every word she spoke carried the weight of truth. Clara stepped forward, Ember following like a shadow. "You called my mother foolish. You whispered about her when she walked away from this place with me in her arms. But she was stronger than any of you, strong enough to raise me when he," she pointed at Jacob, "turned his back, strong enough to carry silence you should have broken for her. And now I carry it no longer. I lay it here, at your feet, for all of you to see." Her words crashed over them like a wave, and the barn seemed to hold its breath. Ember stamped once, his blaze flashing in the light, as if sealing her declaration. Rourke pushed himself off the rail, his movements slow, deliberate. The crowd turned to him, waiting for him to strike back, to reclaim the voice that had once dominated this room. But when he spoke, his voice was low, almost broken. "She speaks the truth. Every word, and I can't take it back." The admission cut through the barn, sharper than a knife. The crowd gasped, some shaking their heads, others murmuring prayers under their breath. Rourke looked smaller than he ever had, his hat in his hands, his pride stripped to the bone. Clara stared at him, her chest rising and falling with the weight of years. "I didn't come here for your forgiveness, Jacob, and I didn't come to claim your name. I came to stand in the place my mother once stood, and to speak what she wasn't allowed to. You don't own this barn. You don't own this land. Not anymore." The final words rang like a brand against old wood, leaving scorch marks that no silence could erase. The crowd fell into uneasy quiet, the weight of change pressing against them. Ember lowered his head against Clara's shoulder, his breath hot and steady, his presence unshaken. Clara looked across the barn one last time, at the faces marked by guilt, by resistance, by awakening. "We're still standing," she said softly but firmly, "and we're not going anywhere." She turned, leading Ember out of the ring. The crowd parted for her, their eyes following, some with tears, some with scorn, but none with indifference. For the first time, Clara felt the ground beneath her feet shift, not in fear, but in belonging. Behind her, Jacob Rourke remained by the rail, his eyes fixed on the daughter he had denied and the horse that had remembered what he tried to forget. And though he said nothing more, the look in his face was no longer pride, no longer shame, but something fragile and unfamiliar. Acceptance. The Wyoming sky opened wide with the kind of light that made the land seem endless, every ridge and valley bathed in gold. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house that had once belonged to Jacob Rourke, the deed now folded and tucked away in her desk inside. The air smelled of sage and cut hay, of earth still damp from a night storm. Black Ember grazed near the corral, his dark coat glistening, his blaze catching the sun like a flame alive. She breathed in the scene slowly, her chest tightening with the weight of what had been lost and what had finally been claimed. The town was quieter now, though the division still lingered. Some nodded when she passed. Others turned away, unwilling to face the truth spoken in the barn. But no one ignored her anymore. The silence that had once defined Mary Bennett's life no longer held sway. Clara had broken it, even if it left the town unsettled, even if it left wounds raw and gaping. Truth rarely healed clean, but it lived, and that was enough. Jacob Rourke came often in the days that followed, though always with the caution of a man approaching a door he wasn't sure he could open. He stood at the fence lines more than he entered, leaning on the rails, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though speaking to it instead of her. One afternoon, Clara walked out to him, Ember trailing at her side. Rourke removed his hat, his voice low, softer than she had ever heard it. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Hell, I don't deserve it. But if you'll let me, I'd like to mend a fence or two. Maybe fix what little I can, even if it's only wood and wire." Clara studied him a long time, searching his face for lies. There were none. Only age, regret, and the hollow look of a man who had carried cowardice too long. She didn't give him what he asked for. She didn't give him forgiveness. But she gave him something smaller, something that might grow. "Show up," she said simply. He nodded, as though the words were more than he had hoped for. And for the first time in decades, Jacob Rourke began to show up. Eli became her shadow, running through the fields with a joy that lit the heavy days. He helped with chores, carried grain, and told Ember stories at night, as though the stallion were an old friend. Boone Carter still came by, though his words were few, his presence steady. Even Irene Kavanaugh, once the town's sharpest tongue, brought jars of preserves and left them on Clara's porch without knocking, her cane tapping against the steps like a soft apology. Clara found herself waking before dawn, slipping into the pasture with Ember. The horse greeted her each morning at the gate, his breath steaming in the chill, his ears pricked toward her voice. She saddled him lightly, riding out into the dew-soaked grass. Each stride of his hooves felt like a conversation, each ride a thread weaving her tighter into the land. The fields that had once belonged to Rourke now stretched before her as if they had always been waiting, not for him, but for her. One evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Clara sat on the porch her mother had once dreamed of returning to. She held the letter Jacob had written, the one Boone had kept, and for the first time she read it without anger. She still hated the weakness in it, the cowardice. But she saw also the love, broken though it was, and she realized love did not erase failure, nor did failure erase love. Her mother had carried both, and now so did she. Black Ember grazed nearby, his silhouette strong against the fading light. He raised his head, ears flicking as if sensing her thoughts, then trotted toward her with a freedom in his gait that no rope could ever break. Clara stood, meeting him in the yard, pressing her forehead against the blaze on his. His breath was warm, steady, and in it she felt something new. Not just memory, not just legacy, but belonging. The wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of wild grass and the faint sound of coyotes calling in the distance. Clara whispered into Ember's mane, her voice trembling with both pain and hope. "We did it. We're free." Jacob watched from the fence line that evening, his hat held, against his chest. He did not speak, did not intrude, but for the first time in his long, pride-choked life, he looked not like a man guarding what was his, but like a man who had finally understood that nothing truly belonged to him. Clara saw him there, and though she gave him no words, she allowed him to remain. That was enough. The town would take years to heal, perhaps longer. Clara knew she would always carry scars, and so would Jacob. But the silence was gone. The truth had been spoken, and she had chosen to stay. As dawn broke the next day, Clara rode Ember out across the open plains, the horizon stretching endless and bright before them. The wind tore at her scarf, the earth shook beneath the stallion's hooves, and for the first time in her life, Clara felt not like the daughter of absence, but like a woman who had claimed her place in the world. The ranch was hers now, but more than that, it was her mother's legacy, her own fire carried forward. And as Ember surged beneath her, mane whipping, bliss flashing, Clara knew she was not just riding land or memory. She was riding freedom itself. And now, after everything you've just witnessed, I want to hear from you. If this story moved you, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Sometimes the smallest words carry the biggest voices. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next powerful story of love, loss, and the unbreakable bond between people and animals. The journey doesn't end here. It's only just beginning.